On the rugged coast of Hellas, formidable Spartan hoplites stood unyielding, embodying an unbreakable force. Their voices, laced with contempt, echoed across the sea, challenging the graceful Athenian triremes that elegantly cut through the waves. At sea, the Athenians reigned supreme, their valiant fleet controlling vital trade routes and coastlines. Yet, on the sun-baked land, the invincible Spartan army held undisputed sway, their phalanxes inspiring dread and capable of crushing any foe. All of Greece was embroiled in the bloody Peloponnesian War. Unseen shadows of spies and cold-blooded assassins crept through the narrow streets of every major polis, sowing terror and distrust. Exhausted urban centers became silent witnesses to a terrifying plague epidemic that mercilessly decimated the population, making no distinction between nobility and commoners. In this dark hour, when hope seemed almost lost, Sparta, in a desperate attempt to turn the tide, was forced to seek aid from Hellas's most sworn enemy. But would this step, this unthinkable alliance, prove to be the decisive factor in the great confrontation, or would it merely hasten an inevitable collapse? Long before these tragic events, in 550 BC, an unprecedented development occurred on the political map of Greece. Sparta, Corinth, Elis, and Tegea, cities renowned for their independence and often their rivalry, united in a coalition previously unseen. This alliance of city-states, proudly named the Peloponnesian League, established control over vast territories in southern Greece, including the strategically vital Peloponnese region, from which it took its name. Their leaders recognized that only by combining their efforts could they resist any external aggressors encroaching upon their lands. Relations between the League members were at times strained, based more on immediate gain than deep friendship, but its practical value was indisputable. Nevertheless, in the coming decades, the members of the Peloponnesian League would need to unite in the face of a looming threat that was brewing beyond their borders and had the potential to alter the fate of all Hellas. Sparta undoubtedly played the role of undisputed leader within its league, effectively utilizing its military might to suppress frequent internal revolts that flared up within its own territories. The warriors of this polis were famed throughout the ancient world for their exceptional discipline and lethal combat tactics, striking terror into their adversaries. Numerous myths and legends recounted their heroic feats, among the most renowned being the story of the Battle of Thermopylae. It was there that King Leonidas and his 300 Spartan hoplites sacrificed their lives in an unequal struggle to delay the rapid advance of the Persian army that had invaded Greece. This act of self-sacrifice allowed other Greek city-states to gather their strength and formulate an effective defensive strategy. However, in 478 BC, a serious threat loomed over Sparta's hegemony. It was at this time that the Delian League began to form. Athens, possessing a powerful fleet, sailed east to liberate Greek cities from Persian rule. After successfully freeing vast territories and numerous islands in the Aegean Sea, these areas united with Athens, and the Delian League swiftly became the dominant force in the region. Athenian victories in significant battles such as Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea strengthened the unity of the city-states that had joined together for mutual defense against potential future Persian aggression. The Delian League continuously expanded, gaining ever-increasing influence and power in the ancient Greek world. Over 300 cities now fell under Athens' direct or indirect control, testament to its growing authority. Thanks to the immense wealth flowing in as tribute from the liberated territories, and a significantly increased number of warriors, Athenian power not only rivaled Sparta's but possibly even surpassed it. Athens imposed strict obligations on all members of the Delian League, demanding tribute both in monetary form and in the provision of warships and military contingents. These vast resources were channeled into intensifying the confrontation with Sparta and its ally, the Peloponnesian League. In the ensuing years, a series of local conflicts inevitably led to the outbreak of full-scale war between these two powerful states, in which only one side was destined to achieve ultimate victory. In the period leading up to 460 BC, sharp contradictions emerged between two city-states of the Peloponnesian League when the conflict between Megara and Corinth reached its peak. Sparta, having historically maintained close ties with Corinth, promptly offered its support. However, perceptive Athenian strategists, closely monitoring the developments, quickly discerned signs of an impending rift within the Peloponnesian League's ranks and decided to exploit the situation for their geopolitical interests. The Athenian leadership began actively supporting Megara, pursuing a twofold objective, either to persuade the city-state to join the Delian League or, at the very least, to significantly weaken Sparta's influence in this strategically important region. As a result, Megara began to strengthen its ties with Athens, and this significant shift in the balance of power did not go unnoticed by the Spartans. The Athenians, steadily expanding their sphere of influence, now openly laid claim to territories traditionally controlled by Sparta. At the same time, covert agents operating within Athenian city-states gradually became a source of serious problems. It became known in Sparta that the Athenians lacked an effective information security system. Numerous spies and informers freely reported to the Spartan leadership that Athens was investing heavily in modernizing its navy, aiming for absolute naval supremacy. Of particular concern to the Spartans was a construction project that could transform Athens into an impregnable fortress. This referred to the erection of the long walls, connecting the city gates of Athens with the ports of Piraeus and Phalerum. Athenian leaders, confident in the might of their fleet, considered a successful blockade of their ports unlikely. This meant that even if besieged, Athens could uninterruptedly receive supplies from Piraeus and Phalerum, using the protected long walls. The construction and large-scale reconstruction of these strategic fortifications served as an unequivocal signal to the Spartans that Athens was preparing for full-scale war in the near future. In 460 BC, the Athenian army approached the borders of Corinth, signaling that ignoring the growing influence of the Delian League was no longer possible. Soon, a series of fierce clashes erupted between Corinth and Athens, officially marking the beginning of the First Peloponnesian War. In response, several members of the Peloponnesian League immediately answered Corinth's call, dispatching their military contingents. Sparta, however, chose to remain aloof at this stage of the unfolding events. Corinthian warriors and their allies successfully contained the Athenian advance and ultimately forced them to withdraw from the territory. Whilst on land the Athenian army failed to achieve significant successes, their fleet steadily grew in strength and numbers. The Athenians established unconditional dominance over the seas, carrying out a series of successful campaigns to capture islands and coastal cities in the Aegean basin. They dispatched part of their fleet to Egypt, seeking to strengthen their position there and expand their influence in this strategically vital region. Over the following decade, a series of bloody battles unfolded across Greece, as members of the Peloponnesian and Delian Leagues sought to expand their spheres of influence and consolidate territorial holdings. And although Sparta had, until this point, only minimally participated in the war, Athenian forces launched a daring invasion of lands controlled by Sparta. This forced Sparta to intensify its involvement in the conflict, and gradually it began to gain the upper hand in land battles across Greece. In 457 BC, the Spartans inflicted a crushing defeat on the Athenian forces at Tanagra. Both sides suffered significant losses, and whilst Sparta's victory was indisputable, it led to both armies opting to return to their cities, avoiding further military action. Capitalizing on the temporary lull in hostilities, Athens made a diplomatic maneuver, approaching Argos, traditionally considered one of the main threats to Spartan dominance over the Peloponnesian League. This move caused serious concern and put the Spartan leadership on heightened readiness for new challenges. Whilst Sparta closely watched Argos and the Delian League in general, the Athenian fleet undertook a series of military operations targeting the coastal areas of the Peloponnese. However, Athens made a mistake by overextending its military resources. Their naval and land forces, deployed in Egypt, suffered defeat at the hands of the Persian army. In 454 BC, the treasury of the Delian League was transferred to Athens, significantly strengthening the polis's dominant position. This move gave Athens unprecedented control over the League's financial flows, allowing it to invest in its own military enterprises. Following the defeat in Egypt and the subsequent restructuring of the Delian League, Athens reduced the intensity of its military operations within the Peloponnesian League. Seeking to gain time to implement ambitious plans to strengthen its naval power, they initiated negotiations for a truce with Sparta. In 446 BC, the so-called 30 Years Peace Treaty was signed between Athens and Sparta. Unfortunately, this period of calm proved significantly shorter than anticipated. Just over a decade after the peace agreement, Athens began to take steps that unequivocally indicated its desire to renew confrontation. The Athenian state actively bolstered its military capabilities and established an extremely harsh system of tribute collection from members of the Delian League, as well as from controlled territories. Simultaneously, Athens systematically increased the size of its land and sea forces. During this period, Sparta observed with growing alarm the strengthening of a potential threat emanating from the northeast. In 433 BC, Athens concluded an alliance with Corcyra, one of Corinth's key colonies. Athenian troops were immediately dispatched to Corcyra, where fierce clashes soon erupted between Athenian and Corinthian military contingents. The following year, in 432 BC, Sparta and its allies in the Peloponnesian League officially accused Athens of violating the terms of the 30 Years' Peace and began active preparations for full-scale war. Athens again disregarded the terms of the peace agreement, issuing an ultimatum to Potidaea demanding the dismantling of all defensive structures. The purpose of this step was to ensure the unhindered transport of timber and minerals from Thrace to Athens and other territories controlled by the Delian League. However, Potidaea rejected these demands and immediately sought aid and protection from Sparta. The Spartan leadership promptly expressed its readiness to provide support and take the city under its protection. Despite being well aware of Potidaea's move under the protection of the Peloponnesian League, Athens nevertheless proceeded to besiege the city. Shortly thereafter, Athens passed the so-called Megarian decrees, imposing a strict prohibition for Megara from using any ports under the control of the Delian League. These measures effectively amounted to declaring a full embargo against Megara, with the aim of undermining its economic power and forcing it to join the Athenian alliance. As Megara remained an integral part of the Peloponnesian League, Athens' actions caused deep outrage in Sparta. It became evident that Athens was prepared to go to any lengths to establish its absolute domination over all of Hellas. Within Spartan circles, the conviction grew that such expansion directly threatened their own hegemony and had to be stopped at all costs. Sparta, demonstrating its unwavering resolve, demanded that Athens immediately revoke the Megarian decrees and restore the previous status quo in the region. However, the Athenian side categorically rejected these demands. Sparta, whilst not entirely prepared for a protracted military conflict, understood that the time for reckoning was approaching, and Athens would pay dearly for its audacity and defiance. Over the next year, Sparta and its numerous allies amassed sufficient military forces to confidently counter Athens' might. They were fully prepared for full-scale military operations, and although the peace treaty was supposed to last much longer, it became clear that Athens could no longer be allowed to dictate its will with impunity and ignore the potential consequences. The decisive event that provoked the escalation of the conflict was the treacherous attack by Thebes, long allied with Sparta, on Plataea, a city under the aegis of the Delian League. Shortly thereafter, Spartan king Archidamus personally led a large-scale invasion of Attica, which formally declared the beginning of the Second Peloponnesian War. The Spartan leadership recognized that their previous detachment from participation in the First Peloponnesian War had been a serious tactical error, and expressed a firm determination not to repeat past mistakes. The full military might of the Peloponnesian League descended upon Athens and its allies. The Second Peloponnesian War marked the formation of a new, far more destructive paradigm of warfare, as this conflict was ultimately to determine the future hegemon of all Greece. Until then, Greek warfare had largely consisted of clashes between hoplite detachments fighting in dense phalanx formations. Warriors formed tight, impenetrable ranks, providing mutual protection with their massive shields and striking with long spears and short swords. However, this traditional strategy was rapidly losing its relevance as combined tactics were increasingly introduced and applied on the battlefields. Hoplites were now integrated into light infantry and cavalry units, opening new possibilities for more dynamic maneuvers and flanking attacks, invariably leading to the rout of entire enemy units. To meet the enormous manpower needs and ensure the necessary size of armies, slaves, mercenaries, and foreign soldiers were actively recruited into their ranks. However, the lack of proper training and years of military experience among these new recruits inevitably led to a sharp increase in casualties among the personnel. As more untrained soldiers appeared in the ranks, commanders focused on improving strategic planning to achieve victory over the enemy. Sparta recognized its superiority in land warfare tactics and possessed valiant warriors, whilst Athens understood that its fleet could inflict a crushing defeat on enemy forces at sea and cause significant damage to coastal settlements. This fundamental division of spheres of influence precluded the possibility of a swift and decisive victory for either of the warring parties over the other. Any successful Spartan campaign on land inevitably met with a harsh response from Athens in the form of devastating coastal raids or the complete destruction of the Peloponnesian fleet. The armed confrontation continued with unabated force, and both sides suffered heavy human losses. Like a well-oiled machine, Sparta and its allies consistently, year after year, carried out devastating raids on territories controlled by the Delian League, methodically approaching Athens itself. The objective of these planned actions was to inflict maximum damage and destabilize the situation. Each of these annual campaigns left a deep trail of destruction and death. Peloponnesian League warriors ruthlessly destroyed vast agricultural lands, demolished fortifications, and sought to disrupt Athens' vital supply channels. However, as Athens maintained the ability to uninterruptedly receive goods, resources, and reinforcements by sea, thanks to its undisputed naval dominance, these annual invasions, at first glance, seemed ineffective. Nevertheless, the Spartan command persistently continued its attacks, pursuing a different, more crucial strategic objective. They hoped to provoke Athenian forces into open battle outside their impregnable walls. The Spartans well understood that in the event of a pitched battle in open terrain, Spartan warriors would, with a high degree of probability, achieve a decisive victory. However, Athenian leaders, led by the far-sighted Pericles, also recognized this danger, and during Spartan invasions, invariably decided that the best option for Athens and its allies was to take refuge behind the reliable city fortifications. Unfortunately for the Athenians, death still penetrated their seemingly impregnable walls. It came not from enemy attack or cunning espionage, but in the form of an invisible microorganism, lurking in the food and goods delivered to the city from distant overseas lands. In 430 BC, this terrible epidemic struck Athens. As a vast number of people were confined within the city walls, the disease spread with incredible speed, like an unstoppable fire. The situation became so critical that Sparta was forced to postpone its annual invasion to minimize the risk of contagion among its warriors from this deadly disease. Athens, gripped by despair, began to plead for peace, attempting to curb the epidemic that was destroying their city. Some inhabitants believed the Spartans had poisoned the water sources, others accused merchants from Egypt and Africa of having brought the plague on their ships. Although the Spartans and their allies refused to cease military operations, they nevertheless decided to keep a safe distance from Athens and the surrounding territories until the raging disease, the plague, was brought under complete control. They shifted their focus to other strategic objectives, but their efforts did not yield the impressive successes they had initially anticipated. At the very beginning of the bloody Second Peloponnesian War, Sparta and its allies were full of confidence in a swift and decisive victory over the mighty Delian League. However, the harsh reality of the conflict dispelled these rosy hopes, prolonging the confrontation for many years. In 429 BC, the deadly plague continued to rage in Athens, dealing a devastating blow to its population and weakening the city from within. Nevertheless, despite this internal catastrophe, the Athenian fleet maintained undisputed dominance over the seas, continuing to effectively contain and punish members of the Peloponnesian League. The Athenians carried out bold raids in the strategically important Corinthian Gulf, demonstrating their naval power and achieving impressive successes. Whilst these events unfolded at sea and around Athens, Sparta and its allies launched a large-scale siege of Plataea, seeking to break the city's resistance. During the Second Peloponnesian War, city sieges became a grim reality, leading to the development and deployment of increasingly brutal and sophisticated tactics aimed at overcoming enemy fortifications and penetrating well-defended settlements. The siege of Plataea serves as a stark example of the mercilessness and ruthlessness employed by both sides of the conflict in their desperate struggle to break the opponent's resistance in this grueling war. Spartan forces encircled Plataea with a tight blockade, cutting the city off from the outside world and depriving it of reinforcements and vital supplies. The Peloponnesians constructed a formidable earth mound to match the height of the city's tall walls, aiming to gain an advantage for an assault. However, observing the relentless growth of this artificial hill, the Plataeans showed ingenuity by building up their own walls, striving to maintain their height advantage and thwart the enemy's plans. In response, the Peloponnesians shifted tactics, launching a direct assault on the city, relying on brute force and the might of their siege engines. Heavy battering rams crashed against Plataea's sturdy walls and massive gates with a deafening roar, aiming to breach the defense. The city's defenders, in turn, hurled down everything they could find from the walls, stones, logs, and even iron chains rained down on the attackers, repelling the Peloponnesian forces after each desperate attempt to approach the fortifications. Faced with the insurmountable obstacle of the city's defenses, the Peloponnesians were forced to adopt a fundamentally different siege strategy. Their soldiers withdrew to a safe distance and began constructing their own wooden wall, designed to completely encircle the perimeter of the besieged settlement. If a direct assault on Plataea proved impossible, the Peloponnesians resolved to subject its inhabitants to agonizing starvation to force their surrender. The Peloponnesians opted for a tactic of patient waiting, confident in the inevitable exhaustion of Plataea's resources and its eventual surrender. In 427 BC, after several agonizing months of starvation, Plataea was forced to admit defeat to the combined forces of Sparta and its allies. Such methods of warfare were characteristic of the Greek world during this widespread conflict. Around 100 city-states underwent sieges during the Second Peloponnesian War. The capture of a city often entailed brutal retribution against its inhabitants. They were either slaughtered or enslaved, stripped of all freedom. In 428 BC, Sparta launched an assault on Lesbos, an island state and an important tributary of Athens, where a revolt had erupted. However, the Athenians demonstrated strategic foresight. Promptly dispatching their naval and land forces to Lesbos, they reinforced their control over Mytilene, the island's administrative center. Upon arrival, the Athenian troops were ordered to execute all men in Mytilene and enslave the remaining inhabitants, intending it as a warning to others. Yet, due to the swift approach of Spartan forces, it was decided to mitigate the punishment, executing only the instigators of the rebellion. Ultimately, the Delian League retained Mytilene and most of Lesbos, pushing the Spartans back to mainland Greece. Between 427 and 425 BC, Athens finally managed to overcome the terrible plague epidemic that had ravaged the city for several years. However, this victory came at a tremendous cost. Between 25 and 35% of the Athenian population, amounting to 75,000 to 100,000 people, fell victim to the disease. Among the deceased was the distinguished statesman Pericles, whose death was a heavy loss for the city. During this time, Sparta continued its military operations in Attica and the vicinity of Athens, but their advance was hampered by the nature of siege warfare, which demanded significant resources and time. Simultaneously, the Athenian fleet maintained its tactic of swift and sudden attacks along the Peloponnesian coast, inflicting significant damage on the enemy. In 424 BC, Athens and its allies in the Delian League, determined to turn the tide of the war, devised a daring plan. They conceived a powerful strike against Syracuse, a key city in Sicily, to coincide with a military campaign in western Greece. Thanks to its naval dominance, the Athenian fleet demonstrated impressive mobility, significantly outmaneuvering the land forces of the Peloponnesian League. The military situation transformed, and it seemed that fortune smiled upon the Delian League. Sparta, recognizing the looming threat, began to show signs of disarray. The Spartans made desperate attempts to consolidate their ranks and entered negotiations with Athens, proposing a new peace treaty. However, the Athenians, intoxicated by recent successes, rejected Sparta's peace overtures. Nevertheless, the Spartan general Brasidas managed to secure a significant victory in Chalcidice, triggering a wave of revolts against the Delian League in other cities and settlements across the region. In 422 BC, Brasidas and the Athenian leader Cleon clashed in the decisive Battle of Amphipolis, where both talented strategists met their deaths. Following Cleon's demise, Nicias took his place and succeeded in persuading Athens to accept Sparta's proposed peace terms, leading to a cessation of the bloody conflict. In 421 BC, after prolonged and fierce battles, a truce was concluded between the Peloponnesian and Delian leagues, known to history as the Peace of Nicias. This treaty stipulated a 50-year period of peaceful coexistence and included certain territorial concessions from both sides. The primary goal was to restore Greece to its pre-war status quo. Unfortunately, not all parties to the conflict were satisfied with the terms of the peace agreement. Some generals refused to return captured territories, which immediately jeopardized the fragile peace. In response, Mantinea, Argos, Elis, Corinth, and Chalcidice formed their own coalition. Sparta, in turn, allied with Boeotia. Meanwhile, the newly elected Athenian leader, Alcibiades, wasted no time, initiating the creation of an alliance between Athens, Argos, Elis, and Mantinea. Every strategic decision made during the era of the Peace of Nicias was aimed at strengthening each side's position. Both the Peloponnesian and Delian leagues recognized the truce was fragile and actively engaged in forming new alliances in anticipation of the inevitable resumption of hostilities. The peaceful lull proved short-lived, lasting only 6 years out of the 50 for which it was intended. This period, from 421 to 415 BC, was marked not only by the active formation of new coalitions but also by an increase in localized armed clashes. War once again engulfed Hellas, heralding the beginning of a second, even more brutal phase of the conflict. Returning from a large-scale military campaign in Thrace, Spartan warriors faced a new calamity. A revolt erupted in Argos. In 418 BC, Spartan forces under King Agis II launched a furious assault on the rebels. The Spartans achieved a decisive victory over Argos and its allies. Sparta's warriors, known for their unrelenting brutality, mercilessly slaughtered the populations of entire cities and settlements that dared to rebel against their overwhelming might. Athens, in turn, demonstrating its own ferocity, committed similar atrocities on the island of Melos, which had consistently supported Sparta in previous years. In 415 BC, the Athenian power lit the fuse that ignited full-scale war, once again dispatching its forces to invade Syracuse, located on the island of Sicily. This was no mere invasion but a meticulously planned military operation. Athens assembled a formidable army comprising over 100 triremes, 6,000 hoplites, and 1,200 cavalry. In this campaign, they staked everything, recognizing that defeat could inflict a devastating blow on their ability to win the war. Command of this massive expedition was entrusted to the Athenian general Alcibiades. Athens desperately needed control over Sicily to strengthen its navy. The island's ample timber reserves would allow for a significant increase in the number of ships and, potentially, crush the Peloponnesian League, establishing complete supremacy in the waters surrounding Greece. The city of Segestes' plea to Athens for protection against Syracuse's escalating aggression became a convenient pretext for Alcibiades to launch his grand military operation, requiring the crossing of nearly 560 kilometers of the Ionian Sea. However, on the eve of the Athenian forces' departure, Alcibiades was unexpectedly accused of sacrilege. These were likely unfounded accusations, instigated by his political enemies within the Athenian government, but it was enough to force Alcibiades to flee. He sought refuge in Sparta, where he provided the Spartans with valuable intelligence about the upcoming campaign and the strength of the Athenian forces. Athens, still aiming to expand its influence, dispatched significant troop contingents under the command of General Nicias with the aim of besieging the strategically important city of Syracuse. The military confrontation erupted with renewed vigor near Sicily, marking the beginning of a 2-year epic of bloody battles. However, in 413 BC, the tide turned in favor of the Syracusans with the arrival of Spartan forces under Gylippus, a seasoned strategist. The Spartans, employing tactical ruses, lured the Athenian fleet into a narrow harbor, where their ships were sunk. Despite this disaster, the Athenians attempted to reinforce their positions by sending reinforcements, but their efforts proved futile. The Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, delivered a crushing blow, forcing the Athenians to flee. The retreat turned into a tragedy, their ships were intercepted and destroyed, and Nicias himself was captured and executed. The Sicilian campaign resulted in the death of 30,000 Athenian soldiers and the loss of most of their fleet. Despite such a massive defeat and irreparable losses, Athens displayed extraordinary resilience, continuing the struggle. They undertook a series of daring raids on the Peloponnesian coast, aiming to weaken the enemy. Alcibiades, who had defected to Sparta, proved to be a valuable advisor. His knowledge of Athenian tactics and vulnerabilities was invaluable. It was he who suggested building a fort at Decelia to deprive Athens of food supplies. When the Spartan king Agis II established his headquarters there, the balance of power shifted. Cities of the Delian League began to defect to the Peloponnesian League. At this pivotal moment, Sparta formed an alliance with Persia, which provided it with financial backing to build a fleet capable of crushing the Athenian squadrons. Persia, in return, demanded only recognition of its authority over Asia Minor. To replenish its lost naval resources and increase the number of fighting units, the Athenian state intensified tax pressure on the Delian League's member cities, sparking a wave of discontent. Various factions within the league began to seek opportunities to break free from total Athenian control. One of the first manifestations of resistance was a revolt on Rhodes, where inhabitants openly sided with Sparta. Soon, a series of revolts swept across the entire Delian League, plunging the Athenian leadership into chaos. The internal crisis reached its climax with the overthrow of democracy and the establishment of an authoritarian regime, which, however, was soon replaced by the more moderate government of the 5000. By 411 BC, the Athenian fleet, demonstrating exceptional resilience, had almost fully restored its former strength. Naval forces once again began to dominate, terrorizing the Peloponnesian coast. During this period, Athenian and Spartan flotillas engaged in continuous naval battles in Greek waters, suffering significant losses. In 408 BC, Lysander, an ambitious general eager to prove his superiority over the Athenians, was appointed commander of the Spartan fleet. A turning point came by 405 BC, when Sparta, having received substantial financial aid from Persia, was able to build a formidable fleet comprising approximately 200 triremes, equipped with advanced weaponry. Lysander skillfully used his ships to lure the Athenians into a decisive battle off the coast of Aegospotami. The large-scale naval engagement resulted in 170 Athenian ships being captured or destroyed. The Spartans did not stop there, they captured 3,000 Athenian soldiers and executed them. The defeat of the Athenian fleet was a true catastrophe, depriving the city not only of a significant portion of its population but also of the vital resources needed to restore its military might at sea and on land. This crushing blow forced Athens to capitulate, leading to the dissolution of the once influential Delian League. In the face of such a widespread crisis, Athens had no opportunity to negotiate or impose any terms. They were compelled to unconditionally accept all of Sparta's demands, including the destruction of the Long Walls, a symbol of Athenian impregnability, the limitation of their fleet to 12 ships, and the obligation to pay tribute to the victors. Sparta, having achieved a decisive victory over the Delian League, which Athens had long led, established itself as the dominant power in the region, controlling most of Greece for the subsequent decades. Nevertheless, Sparta's insatiable thirst for territorial expansion and its desire for dominance, both in northern Greece and in the vast regions of Asia Minor, inevitably led to a clash with Thebes. The culmination of this conflict was the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, where the Spartans suffered a crushing defeat. Sparta's military machine, once thought invincible, never recovered from this blow, while Thebes gradually reclaimed territories that had previously been part of the Spartan state. This historical event, without doubt, marked the decline of Sparta.